My name is Hannah Rivera. I am 34 years old, a woman who writes everything down in a small notebook with a blue elastic band because lists calm storms, and I live in St. Paul, Minnesota, in a brick duplex with a tiny maple tree out front and a front step that always needs sweeping. And I am married to Evan, who is kind and funny and conflict allergic in that way that makes him the peacekeeper until someone needs an actual decision. And our daughter, Lily, is 6 and collects snowflakes on her sleeves like they are trading cards. And I work as an events coordinator for a neighborhood arts center where I have learned that chairs, clocks, and feelings all need to be arranged on purpose, and my world before the trouble was simple in that busy Midwestern way. Work, home, church on Sundays when we were not too tired, dinner with friends who know to take their shoes off without being asked, and the last 6 Christmases have been in Duluth at my in-laws' big craftsman house on the hill, where Margaret, my mother-in-law, runs the holiday like a CEO who also believes in angels on the mantle, and my father-in-law Ted tells the same joke about lutefisk every year because someone has to, and the house smells like cinnamon rolls and lemon cleaner, and my sister-in-law Brittany films everything for her followers and has a voice that can slice deli meat. And the first 5 years I played along with the family choreography because I was new, and the rules seemed to be smile, bring green beans, and let Margaret take the credit. And last year I tried to suggest we add a toy drive for the local shelter, and Margaret said we already do enough, dear. And I swallowed the sentence I wanted to say because I like to be invited back to rooms even when they have a chill. And this year was supposed to be our turn to host back in St. Paul. That had been the plan, written down and agreed in a group text last January by me, because I know that decisions get soft if you do not put them in writing. And in August, Margaret called and said the cousins were flying in, so it made more sense to keep it in Duluth again. And could I still bring the green beans? And I said that we had budgeted and shopped, and Lily had made place cards with her new marker set. And Margaret said the cousins had already booked their hotels, and surely I wouldn't make them cancel. And I stared at the wall and felt that old rug get pulled, and I said, if we do it there, we split the cost, and I am not cooking on Christmas Day in your kitchen for free. And she laughed like I had told a joke. And I said, I am not joking. And that was the first time I drew a line she could actually see. And things moved like dominoes in a tight room. A week later, I got a message in the family group text from Brittany that said, Mom says it's immediate family only at the house this year. Separate kids' activities at the club. Logistics are hard. Thanks for understanding. And my name was not on the RSVP list that followed. And Evan called his mother and she said it was not personal. They were trying to keep numbers small. And he said then, why is your daughter-in-law not invited when the Pilates instructor is? And she said, we owe her. She kept us on a wait list all year. And he said, Mom, what? And she said, never mind, you can still come. We need you to help shovel and pick up the honey-baked ham. And he came into the kitchen and sat at our little table with his hands folded and his mouth tight. And he told me I was banned from Christmas at his parents' house. And I heard the sentence, and it sounded like a dull bell. And I felt the heat in my cheeks and the calm underneath it that comes when someone makes your decision for you. And I said, are you going without me? And he looked scared because he knows I ask kind and exact questions. And he said, I don't know. And I said, pick. And he said, I will not leave you in St. Paul on Christmas Day. And I said, good, because if you had, I would have changed the locks on December 26th. And he laughed then because he laughs when he is frightened. And then he cried a little because boys who were trained to keep peace leak from the eyes when the dam cracks. And I hugged him and told him I loved him, and that if we did not have Christmas at their house, we could have it at ours. And then my phone buzzed with a text from Margaret to me alone that said, I am sorry if your feelings are hurt, but you refuse to be flexible, and this is a family holiday, not an event. And I looked at those words and saw my job title thrown at my face, as if being organized is a crime. And I typed and typed and erased because sometimes the temptation to drag a person is a strong wind. And then I replied, I hope you have a beautiful day. We will not be attending. Under these terms, and I put the phone down and went to the pantry and pulled out my Christmas box, because if I know anything, it is how to turn a room into a party. And Lily came home from school with a drawing of a snowman and a question in her eyes that said, Are we going to Grandma's? And I sat her on the counter and told her we would be home this year and have cocoa and games and a visit to the park if it wasn't too cold, and maybe, if we were lucky, a surprise. And she said, Can the surprise be a puppy? And I said, The surprise will not be a puppy. And she said, Then can it be candy canes? And I said, It can be candy canes. And we both felt better because candy canes are a promise you can keep. The next day at work, I had a rental inquiry for our Arts Center hall from a bakery across the street that wanted a pop-up on Christmas Eve. And while I was on the phone, I looked out our long windows at the gray sky and the parking lot, and the old brick building next door to my in-laws' country club in Duluth flashed in my mind like a grin. A community event space called the Depot Annex that the city rents for meetings and graduations and winter craft fairs. A plain room with high ceilings and cheap chandeliers. And I had looked at it last year when I needed overflow seating for an arts fundraiser and remembered that it had an exterior door 10 yards from the country club's side entrance where Margaret books the Christmas buffet every time she wants to feel fancy without cooking. And I felt a kind of electricity in my fingers that meant an idea had arrived whole. And I excused myself from the bakery call and looked up the city rental portal, and there it was, the Depot Annex, available on December 25th from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., and a list of rules about noise and capacity and insurance that looked like lullabies to me because I speak rule, and the rental fee was a number I could live with, and I thought of the people who get left out at holidays, a cousin who married the wrong person, a neighbor who works retail and cannot drive to Fargo for just a day, a widower who is nobody's problem and everybody's ghost. And I thought of my own friends who spend Christmas in an airport or on a couch or eating cereal over the sink because their families live in other countries or other worlds. And I thought, what if the band and the busy and the bruised had a room with cocoa and a table and a place card with their name written in a nice hand? And I clicked reserve and entered my card. And when the confirmation slid into my inbox with a cheerful ding, I felt that calm again, the one under the heat. And I started a list in my blue notebook titled Plan B that was really Plan A, with better lighting. I asked my boss for the day off because our center is closed on Christmas, but we usually take that time to deep clean, and he said, Please do not bring a mop. Use the day as you need. And I smiled, because kindness from a boss is like finding a 20 in an old coat. And I called my friend Tasha, who works mornings at a catering company, and asked about pickup trays for 50 people. And she said, 50. And I said, I will probably need 70 to be safe, because people bring friends when you feed them. And she said, You are dangerous. And then she said, I like it. And she texted me a menu with glazed ham slices, turkey, mac and cheese, green beans with those crispy onions on top, and a big pan of roasted carrots with honey. And I circled items like a kid in a toy catalog, and we made a deal. I would pay staff price, and in exchange, I would give her teen volunteers community service hours and a real event write-up for their program. And then I called the city events office to ask if Santa could be considered part of the decor since technically live entertainment needed a separate permit. And the clerk said if Santa does not plug anything in and he wraps his own beard, we are not going to police it. And I laughed and wrote down no powered Santa. And then I wrote down, rent speaker, make playlist, borrow hot cocoa urns from church, ask Pastor Doug if I can pick up on the 24th after service, and ask Miss Carol for her sugar cookie recipe because hers holds shape. And I turned my phone face down because the group text was blooming like mold. On Saturday, I drove to Duluth alone under a sky that looked like aluminum, and I parked outside the depot annex and tested my key code and walked the room. It was as I remembered, plain but clean. A scuffed floor that wanted a good sweep, 2 sets of doors, one to the street, and one that looked out at the country club's loading bay with its silver catering carts like astronauts. And I measured wall space for garlands and table space for trays, and I checked the thermostat and the dimmer switch, and the GFCI outlets because nothing ruins a cocoa station like a tripped breaker. And I took photos and made notes. And then I walked outside and looked at the 10 yards between my door and the country club's side entrance, and I imagined the moment when Margaret would see the people she had left out walking into a warm room with twinkle lights, and the sound of children's laughter traveling like birds. And I breathed in cold air and told myself not to be cruel. And I wrote down small details. Signage for Community Christmas All Welcome. Place to put a donation box for the shelter to make it more than spite. Volunteer schedule. And a bright red scarf so I would be the visible host. And I drove home feeling like I had set a bone that had been crooked too long. Sunday evening, I told Evan what I had done, and he sat at our table with the little maple leaf in the window behind him and listened with his hands around his mug, and when I finished, he put his head back and laughed. And then he looked at me like he did the first time we walked around Como Park and said, "I married a woman who does not wait for the door to be opened." And I said, "I married a man who can decide to stand with me even when the floor tilts." And he said, "Send me the volunteer sheet." And he texted his cousin Gabe, who always gets left out of the fancy things because he wears boots to brunch. And Gabe replied in 3 seconds, "I got the truck if you need tables." And I texted my friend Priya, who does design, and she offered to make a simple flyer I could paste into neighborhood Facebook groups. And within an hour, my phone started dinging with notes from people I knew and people I did not. A barista from Lake Avenue said her shift ended at noon, and could she bring extra paper cups? The high school choir director said he had 12 kids who would sing carols if I promised there would be hot chocolate. A nurse said she and 3 co-workers had Christmas Day off and wanted to do something that did not involve sleep or cleaning their own kitchens. And I put all the names on my list and gave them time slots and small jobs, because that is how you turn a mood into a machine. Then the counter-campaign began, because in families there is always a lobby. Margaret posted a long caption on Facebook about how the meaning of Christmas had been lost to logistics and how some people turn holidays into work. And the comment section filled with her church friends saying, "Bless you, Margaret, for keeping things simple." And Brittany posted a video doing a story time where she called me out without saying my name and told her followers that I had always been a little extra, and this year I had tried to monetize Christmas. And I watched the clip twice with a calm face and then deleted the app because my blood does not need that temperature, and I kept moving. I picked up garlands from the craft store on a sale so good the cashier whispered, "Girl." And I baked sugar cookies with Lily and let her decorate one with 9 candy canes, because sometimes a child needs to build a fence around her joy. And I did not answer the 3 texts from Margaret that heaved around words like selfish and divisive. And I told Evan to mute the family chat because his face was starting to look like a weather map. And he did. And he helped me tie bows. And he took Lily to Target because she wanted to choose a toy for the donation box. She picked a doll with curly hair and a tiny suitcase. And when she asked if we could buy a second one for the kid we do not know, I said yes because I want her to remember that part of revenge is giving to people who did not hurt you. 2 days before Christmas, I did a walkthrough with the city clerk and the fire inspector, and the inspector tapped his pen on the floor and said, "Keep the aisle clear. Mind your occupancy. No open flames." And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Hot cocoa is a beverage and not a hazard if kept below scald." And we both smiled because adults sometimes need to say silly sentences to feel official. And I checked the bathrooms for paper and soap, and I wrote one last list: order pickup times, who has keys, who has the card reader for the donation box because some people do not carry cash. And back at home, I printed name tags because not everyone likes to be asked their name 3 times. And I made a playlist that skipped the whiny songs and kept the strong ones. And I set 2 alarms on my phone for Christmas Day, because as much as I know myself, I also know sleep can be a thief if you let it. On Christmas morning, I woke at 6 without the alarm because excitement and fear share a bed. And I put on coffee and we opened 3 gifts with Lily because I wanted her to feel the morning in our home before we stood in a room for other people. And she squealed over a puzzle and a book and a scarf with sparkles, and then helped me pack the car because children become strong when you let them help. And we drove to Duluth with Gabe's truck in front of us, loaded with folding tables I had borrowed from the art center with my boss's blessing. And the sky was a clean white, and the roads were clear because the city had done its work. And I parked behind the depot annex and took a breath and told myself a size 8 woman in a red scarf could move a mountain if the mountain was made of chairs. And then the day unfolded like a well-rehearsed show. Volunteers arriving with cheeks pink from the cold, the choir kids in sweaters and nervous, the nurse with a box of Band-Aids because nurses cannot help themselves, Gabe carrying 2 tables at a time like he was showing off for Santa, and the smell of ham and cinnamon and cocoa starting to draw a line in the air between our door and the club's, and I taped a simple sign on the annex door: Community Christmas, all welcome, no questions, hot cocoa this way. And I opened the side door too because 10 yards is not a distance when there is kindness in the air. By 10:30 we had 20 people in the room, then 40, then more. A man with a cane who said his kids lived in Arizona now, and the airport had eaten his ticket. A woman with a baby who said the baby's father had the car, and she had the stroller, and she was not going to ask him for a ride on Christmas. 2 teenage girls who had ducked out of an awkward morning to help, and then actually helped. And the choir sang, and people cried a little in that easy way that feels like a good sneeze. And at 11, the country club's side door opened and a woman in a black dress with a hostess face came out with 2 servers and looked at our door like she was trying to remember if it had always been there. And I waved because I am polite when I am plotting, and she waved back because her paycheck depends on it. And then I saw Margaret. She had on a red sweater with a white collar and a brooch the size of a cookie, and she stepped out into the cold to bark at the hostess about the parking lot. And then she saw the garlands in our windows and the line of people at our cocoa table, and her face did a thing I had never seen. Not anger, not confusion. Something like the expression of a woman who recognizes her own handwriting on a note she does not remember leaving, and she stood there with her mouth open a little and then closed it and went back inside the country club like a person who needs to pretend nothing is happening. And I kept moving. I taught a teenager how to refill the cocoa urn without making a mess. I showed the nurse where the first aid kit lived. I put Lily in charge of the candy cane basket because I trust 6-year-olds with power when the stakes are candy. And I watched our room grow and grow until we reached our occupancy. And I asked the choir to take a break and let the carols come from a speaker while we watched the door like lifeguards and let people in as others left. Around noon, when the line of people wanting a seat had formed like a polite river, I saw my father-in-law Ted come out of the country club side door alone, hatless and handsome in that retired coach way, and he walked the 10 yards and stopped at our threshold and said, "Hannah," and I said, "Ted," and he looked behind me at the tables and said, "What is this?" And I said, "It is Christmas for everyone." And he looked like he wanted to step inside and like he wanted to run. and I moved a half inch to the side, which is something I learned in crowded rooms when you want to make a path without making a speech. And he stepped in, and the heat hit his face, and his eyes watered, and he said, "Does your mother know you are doing this?" And I said, "She is home in St. Paul with my sister making tamales." And he smiled because he cannot resist food talk. And then he nodded at the donation box and put a 20 in without looking at me and said, "You know your mother-in-law will not like this." And I said, "She already does not like me today, so at least I'm earning it." And he laughed because he is a fair man under his habit. And then he said, "Can I have a cookie?" And I said, "Yes." And he took one and stood for a minute and listened to the songs and watched Lily hand a candy cane to an old woman with blue nails. And he said, "Hannah, you are a problem we needed." And then he went back through the 10 yards and into the club with the cookie in his hand like a treaty. By 1 o'clock, the country club Christmas was in full silly swing. I could hear a DJ on the other side of the loading bay making announcements about raffles and trivia, like he was narrating a game show. And our room had turned into the smooth hum that happens when you put enough hands on a day to carry it without breaking it. And then the moment came that I had not planned but somehow knew would arrive. The side door opened again, and Margaret stepped out with Brittany at her elbow, both holding their phones like shields, and they crossed the 10 yards like a pair of weather systems and stood at our threshold. And Margaret said, "Hannah," and I said, "Margaret," and she said, "What is this exactly?" And I said, "It is a community Christmas. All welcome." And she said, "Next door to my family's holiday." And I said, "Next door to a lot of people's holidays." And she said, "You are making a scene." And I said, "I am making a room." And she said, "You are dividing people." And I said, "People divided themselves when they made lists and left names off." And she said, "Is this because you were not invited?" And I said, "This is because people need a place to go when the door they expected to walk through is shut." And she scanned the room, and she saw 3 of her church ladies at the cocoa table laughing. And she saw Gabe high-fiving a kid with a Santa hat. And she saw Ted near the back, talking to the choir director and nodding like he had found a new game. And her mouth tightened, and she said, "You are trespassing on our day." And I said, "The room is city property and rented legally, and the day is not yours." And Brittany started recording because that is her sport. And I looked at her phone and said, "Make sure you tag the shelter when you post." And she blinked because sarcasm takes a second to load. And Margaret said, "I need you to shut this down." And I said, "I need you to walk back through those doors and enjoy your buffet and leave my room alone." And we stood there like 2 women who had finally been introduced to each other without the men in the middle. And I could feel in my chest that heavy quiet that happens before a scene becomes a memory. And then the choir started Silent Night, and 30 voices found that note that makes even angry people remember their better self. And Margaret's face did not soften, but her shoulders dropped half an inch, and she said, "You always had a flair for the dramatic." And I said, "No, I have a gift for tables and clocks, and this is one." And she turned and walked back to the club, and Brittany posted her clip with a caption about me stealing Christmas. And within an hour, my phone buzzed with 3 texts from people I did not know saying thank you for the space, and one from a friend saying your hair looks great in red. There was still a low point to come because stories need one for the high to ring. At 2 o'clock, the fire inspector returned because a neighbor had called about parking congestion, and he counted heads and gave me a warning for the aisle, and I thanked him because rules save lives. And 5 minutes later, the cocoa urn tripped the breaker and the room went dark on one side, and we had to shuffle tables to find power that would not fail, and 2 toddlers cried because change is hard. And for a minute I thought I had built a tower made of cups that was about to fall. And I went into the small office and closed the door and put my forehead against the cool metal filing cabinet and counted to 10. And I heard in my head Margaret's voice saying, "Family, not event." And I smiled because she was right and wrong. This was a family because we made it one. And I went back out and said, "Okay, team, pivot. Cocoa on table 3, lights on circuit 2, choir acoustic for 20 minutes." And they moved like water because volunteers at a good party are a better force than any one woman's rage. And the room steadied, and I steadied, and the day began to slide toward evening. At 3:30, when the sky outside had turned that deep blue that means Minnesota is getting ready to show you stars if you stay long enough, I saw Evan's phone light up with a text from his mother, and he showed it to me without speaking. It said, "If you bring Lily to say hello, we will let her see her cousins." And my throat got tight, because the word let is a blade in a sentence like that. And I took his face in my hands and said, "Do you want to take her?" And he said, "No, I want to keep our word to our child that we spend the day together." And I kissed him because even after 12 years it still matters when he chooses in public. And I bent to Lily and said, "Do you want to go next door to say hello to Grandma?" And she looked at our room and the candy canes and the choir and the picture she was coloring with the nurse and said, "Can she come here?" And I said, "She chose to be there." And Lily nodded like a small judge and said, "Okay," and went back to coloring. And the hurt was there, but it was small and it had a blanket. And that is what you can do for a 6-year-old when adults misbehave. By 5 p.m., the trays were light, and the cocoa was down to 1 urn, and the choir kids were hoarse and happy. And people began to hug me like I was their cousin, and the donation box was stuffed so full the lid bowed. And the man with the cane told me he had not laughed out loud on Christmas since his wife died. And I told him I wanted to build a habit of this, and he said, "Do." And he wrote his name on the volunteer sheet for next year with a hand that trembled and did not spill. And I stood in the doorway for a minute with my red scarf loose around my neck and watched the country club doors across the 10 yards open and close with little bursts of cold as people in neat outfits walked in and out. And I thought about rooms and doors and who gets to decide what a holiday means. And I decided that the person who sets the table is the person who decides what gets served. At 6, we swept and wiped and stacked and folded. And Gabe loaded tables, and the nurse hugged Lily and told her she would make a good mayor. And I counted the money with the choir director because money likes witnesses. And then I locked the annex and we walked the 10 yards to the country club side door because I wanted to do one dignified thing. And I knocked, and the hostess opened, and I asked if I could leave an envelope for Margaret and Ted, a donation receipt, and a note that said, "Merry Christmas" from the room next door. And the hostess took it with that careful face people wear when they are walking in someone else's family storm. And as we turned to go, the door from the main hall swung open, and Ted stepped out and said, "Hannah." And I said, "Ted." And he said, "Come inside for a minute." And I said, "No, thank you. Our room is closed and my hands smell like cocoa and Lysol and I am going home." And he laughed and said, "Fair." And he hugged me like a father hugs a daughter he respects. And in that moment, the revenge I had built turned into something better. It was not fire. It was a frame. And inside, it was a picture of a family that might learn how to behave. We drove home under a sky that had finally decided to show the stars, and Lily fell asleep in her seat with a candy cane stuck to her mitten, and Evan reached for my hand at a stoplight and said, "You did it." And I said, "We did it." And my phone vibrated on the console with a message from an unknown number. It was a photo of the watch on a wrist I recognized, and a sentence. She says, "You stole our Christmas, but I think you built one." From Brittany. And I smiled because sometimes the person who films you will also one day watch you. And I put the phone face down and looked at our sleeping child and imagined next year. And I felt tired in my bones and strong in my mind. And when we got home, I carried Lily to bed and tucked her in and washed my hands again, because days like this cling. And I sat at our small table and opened my blue notebook and wrote a new list titled "Next Time." And I added rent more cocoa urns, hand warmers for door volunteers, choir mic that does not buzz, and a line that said, "Invite Ted to help set up because men who bring cookies do not flip tables." And I closed the book and leaned back and listened to the quiet of our house and the small buzz of the fridge and the way a life sounds when you have chosen it on purpose. And in the morning, I would answer the texts and the comments and the gossip with one sentence. We hosted a community Christmas at the annex and raised $1,200 for the shelter and served about 100 people cocoa and mac and cheese. Love, Hannah. And I would say it without rage and without apology because the work had already made the case. And yet the story was not finished because families do not end their plays in one act. 3 days later, a yellow envelope arrived by mail from Duluth, with Margaret's handwriting on the front like a ruler. Inside was a note on country club stationery that said, "I do not appreciate theatrics, and next year we will be going to Cancun for Christmas as a family." And a second paper, a photocopy of a receipt for our share of last year's buffet that she claimed she had forgotten to send me, and a sticky note that said, "Please remit." And I laughed because it was so on brand I could have made it in a lab. And I wrote her a check for half of half because she had counted wrong. And I included a photocopy of the annex receipt and the shelter thank you note and wrote, "We are starting a new thing too. You are welcome." And slid it into the envelope with a peppermint because sweetness is my policy even when I am done being sweet. And I took a candy cane out of the bowl for myself and texted my boss, "We need to block the annex for next Christmas early." And he replied with a thumbs up and a link to the calendar. And I clicked it and smiled and started another list. The year rolled forward like a careful sled, slow at first and then faster when the hill insisted. And winter in St. Paul did what it always does. It threw snow at the windows and dared us to call it pretty. And I went back to work and answered emails and booked birthday parties and gallery nights. And the annex day began to live in people's mouths. As a small good roomer, the choir director sent me a handwritten note with 12 signatures and a drawing of a cocoa cup. The nurse dropped off a box of extra Band-Aids with a sticky note that said, "For next time." Gabe texted me a photo of a new set of folding tables someone at his job was giving away. And Ted stopped by our duplex one Sunday afternoon with a bakery box, and Lily answered the door in her socks and yelled, "Grandpa," and he stood in my kitchen with his hat in his hand and said, "I have the wrong words for what I think about what you did, but my mouth will keep trying." And he took off his hat and put it on the counter as if to show he planned to stay for more than a minute. And we ate cookies and drank coffee. And he told me a story about coaching basketball in 1989 and how a kid who always sat the bench won a game because someone finally put him in when the room was hot and loud and everyone else had lost their head. And I looked at him and he looked at me, and we both knew we were not talking about basketball. And before he left, he asked if he could help with the annex next year. And I handed him my blue notebook and said, "Write your name under volunteers." And he did, with a coach's sharp pencil hand that makes letters look like orders. And when he walked out into the cold, he said, "Hannah, I am not good at choosing against my wife, but I'm trying to get good at choosing for what is right." And I said, "That is the same motion if you stand in the right place." And he nodded like a man who had finally seen the court from a new angle. Margaret did not speak to me for 2 months, which is a kind of peace. Brittany posted 2 videos about boundaries and Christmas drama, but never used my name again. Her followers argued in the comments about whether a community event is generous or manipulative, and I let them because strangers on the internet are not my shepherds. And I focused on my house because houses teach you to keep your hands busy while your head grows. I painted Lily's room a soft yellow and let her put glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, even though I knew they would peel at the corners. I cleaned out the hall closet and found 4 scarves I forgot I owned. I sat with Evan after Lily was asleep and we played a card game and talked about nothing because you cannot always talk about the big thing without turning yourself into a speech. And in March, my boss asked me to take on the summer festival, and I said yes, as long as I get to choose the vendors, because I am done with people who think working with me means I will carry their weight and their bill. And he said yes because he likes profit and employee morale in equal measure. And I understood something simple and late, that the skill I use to turn rooms into places where people feel held is not a trick. It is a spine. And once you straighten it, other things line up too. Spring brought the family meeting I had known would come. Margaret loves spring like a cat loves a sunbeam, and she texted a sunny invitation to a brunch in Duluth. Family only. Let's move forward. And I agreed because forward is a direction I believe in when a hand is not on my head. And we drove up, and Lily counted lakes out the window, and Evan rehearsed out loud, not saying I'm sorry for things that are not his fault. And we walked into the house that smells like lemon cleaner and cinnamon, and Margaret hugged Lily hard and hugged Evan medium and hugged me as if etiquette had demanded it. And we sat at the long table with the blue runner and the plates that used to live in a department store. And Margaret began a speech about tradition and respect and tone, words she likes to wear like a scarf. And I sat with my hands folded and my face calm and waited for the clause where I was the subject. And she said, I did not like being the villain at Christmas. And I said, I did not like being banned. And she said, I never banned you. And I said, your daughter banned me on your orders. And she started to deny, and Ted touched her wrist like a man turning down a burner and said, you did, Margaret. Own it. And she blinked because he had said something out loud in front of a witness. And she took a sip of water and said, I felt pushed. And I said, I felt erased. And she said, I have been hosting for 30 years. And I said, and I have been invited for 6. And last year, I was uninvited. And if we continue this conversation with me in the child chair, it will not land. And she looked at me like a sparring partner who has finally realized the other person trains. And she said, you humiliated me. And I said, I made a room for people your list forgot. And she said, you did it next door. And I said, yes. It was cost-effective and symbolic. And she almost laughed, but then remembered she was mad, and Evan said, Mom, why do you think your comfort equals the family's health? And she looked at her son like he had knocked on the front door of a house she thought was locked from the inside. And she said, because I keep the calendar. And I said, then let's keep it together. And she said, what does that even mean? And I took my blue notebook out of my bag and put it on the table and said, it means we write down who hosts when and who pays what and who gets to say no. It means we stop pretending tradition is a law and start treating it like a habit that needs to earn its place. And Ted said, I like this. And Brittany said, this is so extra. And I said, extra is what you call a woman who makes a plan you benefit from. And she blushed, because even she knows a good line when it lands. And we made a calendar with pencils because pencils forgive. And we set rules that were so basic it hurt to say them out loud. No one gets banned. If you cannot attend, you wish the host well and do not sabotage. Money is discussed before menus. If a child is used as a pawn, you lose your move next holiday. And Margaret signed the paper because she did not want to be the only one who did not. And I signed, and Evan signed, and Ted signed, and Brittany drew a heart, because even when she is sincere, she thinks like a camera. And when we finished, the brunch tasted better, and the house felt lighter, and Lily found a drawer full of paper doilies and asked if she could have some. And Margaret said yes, take them all. And Lily made a crown out of them in the back seat on the drive home, like a child who has always known paper can be a crown. Summer work was its own storm, and I wrote it with my lists and my calm voice. And when I felt my shoulders go up, I put them down and took a breath and cut one item off my schedule that did not pay me back in money or quiet. And in August, a small box arrived from the choir kids with a photo of our annex day made into a magnet, and I put it on the fridge, and Lily moved her school art down one slot to make room and said, "This one is important because it has people on it who are not related and still belong." And I kissed the top of her head because sometimes your child summarizes the year in a sentence you did not teach her, and you have to record it with your mouth. And in September, Margaret announced in the family chat that she and Ted had booked Cancun for Christmas. And the cousins chimed in with emojis, and Brittany posted a poll about swimsuits. And I felt that old twinge that says you will be tested again. And I typed, "That sounds lovely. We will not be traveling. We will be in St. Paul hosting community Christmas at the Annex again. All welcome." And I attached the flyer mock-up Priya had made this time with better fonts. And I put the phone down and made dinner, and watched the sun slide off the edge of the day like a plate into soapy water. And when the phone buzzed again, it was Ted sending a thumbs up and a private text that said, "Our flights are cancelable." And I wrote back, "Go where you want for the right reasons. We will host for the right reasons." And he wrote, "Maybe the right reason is to be there handing out cocoa." And I wrote, "We have aprons now with pockets." And he wrote, "Sold." And the next day he called and said, "We are skipping Cancun and staying in Duluth to help. Do you need me to wrangle parking?" And I said, "I love a man who brings traffic cones to a feeling." And he laughed and said, "I will wear my old coach whistle if you make me." And I said, "Bring it in your pocket just in case." The second Annex Christmas was both easier and harder. Easier because the city clerk knew my face, and the fire inspector liked our aisle plan, and the volunteers from last year signed up without me asking twice. Harder because word had gotten around and we needed more of everything: more tables, more cocoa, more hand warmers, more songs. And I learned from the first year and delegated more ruthlessly. I put Gabe in charge of tables, and he wore a hat that said foreman on it. I put the nurse in charge of the first aid, and she made a small station with a sign that said, "You are not allowed to bleed alone." I put the choir director in charge of the sound, and he brought a new mic that did not buzz. And I put Ted on parking, and he did, in fact, bring cones and a whistle. And watching a 70-year-old man in a Santa hat direct SUVs and minivans like a homecoming parade made people cheerful before they even stepped into the room. And the day itself had the same spine. People who expected little and got a bowl of mac and cheese and a seat and a song and a candy cane from a 6-year-old who was now 7. And at noon I took a breath and stepped outside for cool air, and I saw Margaret standing at the edge of the lot in a coat the color of money. She held a small tin in her hands, and she looked like a statue of a saint who cannot decide which miracle to perform. And she walked toward me, and I stood because I stand up when people approach, even if they have been unkind. And she said, "Ted told me we are not going to Cancun." And I said, "I heard." And she said, "I brought fudge for your volunteers." And I said, "They will eat it." And she said, "Do you need hands?" And I nodded at the sign-in table and said, "If you can write names without asking for last names or reasons, you can sign them in." And she pursed her lips like a woman tasting new food. And then she walked to the table and wrote neatly and looked up and smiled at people, like she had remembered something she learned before she learned to be in charge. And she worked for 2 hours and did not give orders and did not cry and did not film herself. And when she needed to sit, she sat. And then she stood and worked again. And for the first time in 12 years, she felt like a person and not a position. And I filed that away as something to use later when the weather turned. In the middle of the afternoon, a woman came in who looked like she had run all the way from another town, hair loose, jacket unzipped, eyes bright with that holiday panic that comes when your ride falls through. And she said, "My kids are with their dad and the pickup spot shut early and the bus is not running. Is there anywhere they can be warm until he can get them?" And I said, "You brought them." And she said, "No, they're with him." And I heard what she did not say, that the plan was ugly and the day had teeth. And I put her at a table with Coco and asked her name, and she said June. And I wrote it on a tag and handed her a candy cane, because candy canes are small and strong. And 10 minutes later, Ted came in from the parking lot with 2 kids and a man, with a face that said he had once been handsome in a way that made people forgive him. And Ted said, "These are June's." And the man tried to leave, and I stepped into the door like a person who does not allow a story to get stuck, and said, "Stay and feed them." And he opened his mouth to complain, and June stood and said, "Sit." And he did. And the kids ate, and the parents did not talk, but they did not fight. And after an hour, they left with coats zipped, and a plan written on the back of one of our volunteer forms. And I did not feel like a hero. I felt like a woman who has made enough rooms to know that half of kindness is air and a chair. We closed earlier that year because the snow began to act like it had a grudge, and volunteers did the sweep of champions, and the nurse hugged me, and the choir director bowed, and Gabe loaded tables, and Ted stacked cones like a man boxing trophies, and Margaret stood with her tin now empty and said, "I had fun." And then she said, "I do not say that often enough about things other people plan." And I said, "I noticed." And she almost smiled and then said, "Next year, could we combine?" And I said, "We do not combine. We coexist. Your house or your club can have what it likes, and my room will be here." And she said, "I am still the matriarch." And I said, "Then act like the kind that adopts." And her eyes watered because the sentence had landed where it was supposed to. And she nodded and said, "I will bring more fudge." And I said, "And a roll of raffle tickets for blankets and bus passes." And she said, "I can do that." And we walked into the snow, and she put her hand on my arm as if to steady herself, and I let it stay for 3 seconds, which is how long you give an old habit to sit before you ask it to stand up and leave. January took the lights down, and the sidewalks turned into puzzles, and school began again, and life resumed its small sounds. And one afternoon in February, Brittany called me, which she does not do. She usually texts strings of emojis, and her voice was smaller than her videos, and she said, "Can you help me plan a fundraiser for a shelter?" And I said, "Which one?" And she said, "The one you raised money for." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "I want to do it right." And I said, "You start with a list and a budget, and you do not use a ring light during meetings." And she laughed and said, "Okay." And we met at a coffee shop, and she took real notes and made fewer jokes. And when she filmed the shelter director speaking and not herself. And afterwards she sent me a text that said, "I never learned how to be useful without being seen. Thank you for letting me practice." And I sat in my car and cried, because that is not something you post even if you are tempted. It is something you keep as proof that women can learn new dances if someone leaves the lights on long enough. I would like to tell you the family stayed soft forever, but summers still bring loud group texts, and fall still brings schedules that assume my calendar is a trampoline. And Margaret still tries to choose venues that comp her dessert and call it generosity. And sometimes I still have to say no in a voice that makes Lily look up from her crayons because she recognizes the tone I use when the dog is about to eat a sock. And sometimes Evan still has to choose in public. And sometimes we go home tired and ask each other why we keep showing up. And then we remember that inside the machinery of holidays and schedules, there are people we love who did not pick the factory they were made in. And we make a small pot of cocoa, and we put a candy cane in it, even though it is July. And we remember that the annex exists even when it is closed. It exists as proof that a woman can set up tables next door to the room that did not want her and feed everybody anyway. The twist, if you want one to send you out with a grin, came not the next Christmas but the one after, the third annex year. The one where we had matching aprons and a printed banner and a clipboard that said, "Check in like a flight." A winter storm moved in fast and mean at 3 p.m., snow sideways, wind like a jealous aunt. And I was ready to close early when the country club lost power because their generator had not been serviced in 18 months, and the place went dark in a way that rich rooms do not like. And their DJ tried to make jokes in the dark, and a child cried, and a woman in a very nice dress swore under her breath because her shoes were not made for moving fast. And Ted was already at our door with cones and a whistle and said, "Open the side entrance. We are about to have company." And we did. A line of people in nice coats and thin gloves and surprised faces, and we moved them in and handed them cocoa and mac and cheese and a blanket from our donation pile, and someone from our choir started a carol, and someone else lit the big battery lanterns, and voila! The club's Christmas became our Christmas without paperwork, and I stood at the threshold and watched Margaret walk in holding a platter of uneaten salmon because she is who she is. And she looked at me in the half-light and said, "I suppose you planned this." And I said, "I did not. But I did maintain the extension cords and the batteries and the goodwill." And she laughed, really laughed, and said, "Merry Christmas, room builder." And I said, "Merry Christmas, fudge maker." And we did not hug because we are not there yet, and maybe never. But she handed me the platter and I handed her a ladle, and we both kept moving because rooms run on hands, not grudges. And later, after the storm eased and the city fixed the wires, and we were down to crumbs and rinsed pans and the last 2 candy canes stuck to the bottom of the bowl, she brought me a small wrapped box and said, "Do not yell at me." And I said, "I do not yell." And she said, "You have a voice that can move furniture." And I said, "Thank you." And I opened the box, and inside was a brass key on a red ribbon. And she said, "It is for the side door to the club, just in case. Not because you owe us anything, because sometimes rooms need each other." And my throat did the thing throats do when a woman you learn to brace against learns to share a pocket. And I said, "I will keep it in my drawer, and I will only use it if my cocoa spills into your carpet." And she said, "It already has, and I am not mad." And then she touched the ribbon and said, "I like that we have different keys to the same holiday." And I said, "So do I." So that is the story. The long one with chairs and doors and lists and cocoa and a red scarf and a watch. We did not need to argue about because we found a better timekeeper, a room full of people who were not on anyone's list, and a woman who decided to stop asking for a seat and bring her own. And if you are sitting somewhere with an invitation in one hand and a bruise in the other, here is my suggestion. Write a list. Rent a room if you can. A library meeting room. A church basement. A park shelter with walls. Pull the tables down. Put the chairs in a circle. Make a pot of something hot. Tape a sign to the door that says, "All welcome," and mean it. Tell the person who told you to stay home that you are not home. You are next door doing what holidays are for. And if they stand in the 10 yards between your door and theirs and try to make you small, remember that the door belongs to whoever opens it. And remember that revenge for a woman like us is not slamming a gate. It is buying hinges and handing them out. And remember that a candy cane is a policy, not a decoration, and that a child who hands one to a stranger is doing more for the world than 1,000 posts about who stole Christmas. And when you go home tired and smelling like cocoa and Lysol and cold air and hope, you can sit at your table and write in your notebook a new list titled "Next Time," because there will always be a next time as long as there are rooms, and as long as there are people who think they belong in them more than you, and as long as there are women with red scarves and strong voices and soft hands who know how to move chairs and feelings without breaking either. And when the lights go out next door, you will be ready, because you will have maintained your batteries and your grace. and both of those are part of the job. And when your child asks in July if you can make cocoa, you will say yes, because you can, and because the annex, once you have found it, lives in your kitchen too.